19 years in radiology has a way of shaping not only how you see the human body, but how you come to understand truth itself. Bones, in particular, have always struck me as the most honest part of a person. Flesh lies. Flesh bruises, swells, distorts under pressure. Muscles tighten or slacken depending on the story a patient is trying to tell. But the skeleton, no matter how it is twisted or fractured, never deceives. In my field, the bones don't lie. That had been my mantra for almost 2 decades. The hospital where I spent those years was a massive teaching institution, a kind of city within a city. Every hallway hummed with fluorescent light. Every corridor smelled faintly of antiseptic and the chemical bite of disinfectants. The radiology wing sat deep inside the complex, behind lead-lined walls and heavy mechanical doors designed to keep radiation inside and the world outside. I had always thought of it as a monastery of sorts, quiet, disciplined, filled with shadows and revelations that only the trained eye could interpret. My days, and often my nights, followed a rhythm so practiced it bordered on ritual. I would arrive before dawn, when the city's sirens were still muted, and adjust the blinds in my office to block the glare from streetlights. By mid-morning, the wing came alive with residents and interns hauling carts of film or whispering anxiously about contrast ratios. At 3 a.m., my favorite hour, I would pour a bitter cup of coffee from the vending machine and retreat to the film archive. There, with only the gurgle of chemical baths and the red glow of the darkroom lamp, I would study images that felt like confessions. Every case was a puzzle. The faint shadow of a collapsed lung, the clean line of a spiral fracture, the jagged bloom of a tumor that had gone unnoticed until too late. I found comfort in this discipline, in the predictability of it. For nearly 20 years, I believed that radiology was an art of certainty, an unbroken chain of cause and effect. I no longer believe that. There was one case, one sequence of images, that ruptured the foundation of my career, and with it, my understanding of what bones could say. Even now, long after my resignation, those plates haunt me. They developed themselves in silence, without exposure, without a patient, as if time itself had passed through them. That was the beginning of my most terrifying case, the one that ended everything I thought I knew, and it started, like most nights, with a routine shift. The night it began was unremarkable. A Tuesday, or perhaps a Wednesday. I can no longer be certain. The days had blurred together into the endless cadence of the hospital, a tide of emergencies and routine scans. I remember the clock on the wall above the darkroom sink read 2:47 a.m. when I pulled the first blank plate from storage. X-ray plates are simple in principle. Each one is coated with a photosensitive emulsion, invisible to the naked eye, but reactive when exposed to radiation. Under normal conditions, without that exposure, the plate remains nothing more than a sheet of chemically inert blackness. Like photographic film that has never seen light, a blank plate should remain blank. Always. The laws of physics are not negotiable. I slid the plate into the developer bath, the way I had done tens of thousands of times before. The chemicals swirled, their smell sharp and metallic, a mixture of vinegar and rust. At first, the emulsion appeared as expected, opaque, featureless. But then, slowly, faint lines began to emerge, pale strokes, delicate as pencil marks, coalescing into a recognizable pattern. A pelvis. I leaned closer, convinced it was contamination, a chemical spill, perhaps, or a plate accidentally pre-exposed. But the details sharpened with every second. The iliac crests arched perfectly. The femoral heads sat in their sockets, and there, unmistakably, was a fracture. A clean break across the pubic bone, reinforced with surgical screws already in place. The hairs on my arms lifted. This was impossible. An X-ray plate does not invent anatomy. It records what is placed before it. Without a patient, there can be no image. To develop an unexposed plate into a complete skeleton was as absurd as pulling an undeveloped photograph from a camera and finding it already filled with the image of a stranger's face. Repeated the process 3 times with different plates, each one carefully marked, each one pulled from fresh stock. Only one showed the anomaly, but the image was perfect. The rest remained as they should, black, silent. By morning, I had convinced myself it was contamination. Perhaps a student had mishandled a plate, or an old exposure had bled through from improper storage. These things happen, rare though they are. The human mind clings to explanation. At 7:12 a.m., the emergency department called down. A trauma case. Motor vehicle collision. I prepared the room, barely thinking of the anomaly. As the orderlies wheeled in the patient, he was unconscious, his face pale, his torso strapped tight against the gurney. When we slid the plate beneath him and aligned the machine, I felt my chest tighten, because I already knew what I would see. The first scan confirmed it. A fractured pelvis, surgically stabilized with metal screws from an earlier injury. The contours matched the plate from hours before. Identical. I showed the films to Dr. Elena Marković, the pathology resident on duty. She frowned, tapped her pen against the light box, and dismissed my concern with a shrug. Misfiled plate. You must have grabbed an old one. It happens. Her tone was casual, practiced, as though she were lecturing a nervous intern. But I knew my own methods. I double-check everything. There had been no misfile, no contamination, no accident. When she left, I locked the anomalous plate in the bottom drawer of my desk. My hands trembled as I slid the key into place. Even then, I told myself it was nothing, a coincidence, an error. Anomalies are rare, but they occur, and in a hospital like ours, strangeness sometimes filters through the cracks of routine. But in the quiet of the darkroom, the image glowed faintly on its own, as if the bones themselves had burned their way onto the film. And for the first time in 19 years, I began to doubt my mantra. The second occurrence came 3 nights later. By then, I had convinced myself the first incident was a freak contamination, some 1 in 10,000 error that would never repeat. My mind clung to that explanation because the alternative, that the plate had captured an image before the patient arrived, was not only unscientific, it was absurd. But when the next plate emerged, all my rational scaffolding began to collapse. It was nearly 1 a.m. I was alone in the radiology wing, the hum of fluorescent lights my only company. I had been reviewing chest films when I decided, almost out of nervous habit, to check another blank plate. The red glow of the darkroom lamp cast long shadows as I lowered the plate into the developer bath. The lines appeared faster this time, a thoracic cavity, the ribs outlined in perfect symmetry, but the left side, the ribs there were shattered inward, puncturing the lung field. The heart shadow was displaced, a catastrophic trauma, one that would leave a patient gasping for breath if they lived at all. I froze. The chemicals gurgled softly as the image clarified. The fractures were sharp, not blurred, not accidental. At 2:17 a.m., the emergency line rang. A call from the ER. A man had been brought in from an industrial accident. Crushed chest. Multiple rib fractures on the left side. When I placed his first film beside the anomalous plate, my hands shook. They matched. Perfectly. The fractures, aligned, each rib snapped in the same place, each displacement identical. Coincidence is easy to invoke once, twice, under identical circumstances, becomes something else. I began keeping records. Every time a plate developed on its own, I wrote down the timestamp and sealed the image in a locked drawer. Then I waited. Without fail, Every plate corresponded to a patient who arrived later that night, or sometimes the next day. The match rate was 100%. I knew what the explanation must be. Faulty storage, improper handling, perhaps light leakage contaminating the emulsion. These things happen in theory, though not in a facility as tightly maintained as ours. To test it, I involved Elena. She was reluctant at first, rolling her eyes as if humoring a senior physician. But she agreed to help, perhaps out of curiosity. Together we ran contamination checks, measuring radiation leakage, reviewing storage logs, testing batches of developer chemicals for irregularities. Everything was normal, perfectly normal. I showed her the sequence of anomalous plates. She examined them, tapping the edge of each with her pen. "It's contamination," she insisted. "It has to be. There's no mechanism otherwise. These images don't just appear." She was right. There was no mechanism. Radiographic plates don't work like that. Without exposure, they remain blank. It is the same as film in a camera. Without light, you have nothing but darkness. 4. A plate to reveal a skeleton without a patient present was like finding an entire diary written in ink before the pen had touched paper. Yet the evidence was in front of us. I started to see the plates differently. They were not contaminated artifacts. They were messages, each one a record of an injury not yet sustained, a fragment of a future already fixed. The thought unsettled me more than I care to admit. In medicine, we rely on predictability, cause and effect. A broken rib shows up on film because something, an accident, a blow, a fall, caused it. But here, the effect was showing itself before the cause. It was as if the universe were revealing the punchline before the joke. One evening, while reviewing the latest anomalies, I wrote in my logbook, "It is as if a blank diary began writing, strangers' deaths before they occurred." I did not show that line to Elena. The situation grew more complicated when the hospital administration began to notice irregularities. My colleagues whispered about missing plates, about me spending long hours in the darkroom with locked drawers. A senior administrator pulled me aside, hinting that falsifying images could end my career. The suggestion stung. I had built my reputation on precision, on trust. Now that very reputation made me look unstable. I told them nothing. How could I? To admit what I had seen would sound like madness. Still, the plates kept coming. Every few nights, another developed without exposure, each one a perfect, impossible snapshot of someone not yet in the building. I stopped sleeping. My dreams were filled with white silhouettes flickering on black backgrounds, bones glowing faintly as though lit from within. Each time I woke, I wondered if another plate was waiting for me in the darkroom, whispering its truth before the hospital doors opened. The logical part of me, the part trained to rely on evidence, was unraveling. I had the evidence, yes, but not the logic. The bones, which had never lied to me before, were speaking in a language that defied science. And for the first time in my career, I found myself afraid of what the next plate might reveal. By the 4th week, I had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the impossible. A plate would bloom with skeletal certainty, and within hours, the patient would arrive, broken, torn, or bleeding in precisely the way foretold. Each match felt like a blow to my rational mind, yet a part of me began anticipating them, as though, waiting for a storm I could not divert. Then one night, the storm struck home. The darkroom was quiet except for the low gurgle of the developer bath. I had placed another blank plate into the chemicals more out of compulsion than necessity. My hands moved by rote, though my stomach tightened with every swirl of the tray. At first, faint arcs appeared, curved lines resolving into the familiar sweep of a human skull. I leaned closer, expecting another stranger's anatomy. But as the features clarified, I froze. The fracture ran diagonally across the parietal bone, jagged and sharp, and beside the image, embedded faintly in the corner of the plate, was a signature artifact, an orthodontic alignment pin that I recognized from the routine check we'd done days earlier on a staff member, Elena. The realization struck like cold water. It was Elena's skull. I stood there far longer than I should have, the red lamp bathing the room in its silent glow. My thoughts split in two. The radiologist in me catalogued the fracture clinically. Impact consistent with a fall. Possible. Epidural hematoma. Risk of brain bleed. The human in me recoiled, knowing this was no stranger, no anonymous patient, but a colleague who had stood beside me only hours earlier. When I showed her the plate, she laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. "You're joking," she said, though her eyes flicked over the fracture line with undeniable recognition. "It looks like my skull, yes. But how? Did you stage this?" I told her the truth, that the plate had developed itself, that I feared what it meant. She shook her head. "It's a prank. Someone is trying to scare you, or maybe you've been spending too much time in this wing." Her skepticism was a shield, but her unease lingered. I saw it in the way she tapped her pen against the table, too quickly, and the way she avoided the darkroom for the rest of the shift. Hours later, the call came. A code alert from the stairwell near the pathology lab. I ran, my chest already heavy with dread. She had slipped. The emergency lights flickered above as I found her sitting against the wall, blood running from her temple, her eyes glassy with shock. The fall had fractured her skull, precisely where the plate had predicted. She survived. Surgery stabilized the bleed, and within days she was back on light duty, pale and subdued, her skepticism muted. She avoided discussing the plate altogether, but her silence was more damning than words. She had seen the fracture before it happened. We both had. After that night, I began hearing it. It started as faint clicking noises in the empty radiology rooms, soft bursts like the static chatter of a Geiger counter. At first I thought it was faulty wiring, perhaps interference from the hospital's outdated systems. But the sounds were too regular, too insistent. They came only when I stood near the storage cabinet, where the anomalous plates were locked away. Click, click, click. Like a signal registering from an invisible source. In the stillness of the radiology wing, the noises seemed almost like whispers. Not words exactly, but rhythms, as if the air itself were counting down to the next fracture, the next wound. I began to dread the darkroom. The red glow no longer felt like sanctuary. The bubbling developer bath sounded too much like breathing. Each plate I dipped felt like a confession wrung from the future, and I was no longer certain I wanted to know what was coming. The hospital administration grew restless. Questions circulated about my judgment, about Elena's accident, about why I was filing restricted reports. I deflected as best I could, but their suspicion gnawed at me. The more I tried to hide the impossible, the more obvious my obsession became. Alone at night, I would unlock the drawer and study the plates in sequence. They formed a macabre gallery. Shattered ribs, twisted spines, fractured femurs. Each one a life waiting to be broken, and now, among them, Elena's skull sat like an indictment. Proof that these plates did not merely predict strangers. They could reach into the lives of those closest to me, perhaps into my own. That thought lingered as I turned the key, sealing the drawer once more. The clicks from the empty room echoed faintly, like bone on bone. And I wondered, not for the first time, whether time itself was whispering through the film, and whether any of us could escape what it had already written. Sleep abandoned me, entirely in those weeks. I existed in a half-life of caffeine, fluorescent hum, and the steady click of machines that no longer felt like instruments of certainty, but conduits for something I could not define. The plates multiplied. At first, 1 or 2 a week, then nearly every night. I stopped resisting their arrival. Instead, I began to catalogue them meticulously. Date, time, physical description of the anomaly, the eventual patient match. The sequence became undeniable. Each plate preceded its subject. The lag varied, sometimes hours, sometimes days, but the fidelity was absolute. It was no longer coincidence. It was chronology. One night, under the red glow of the darkroom, I spread them across the counter in order of their appearance. Rib cage after rib cage, pelvis after pelvis, vertebrae bent or shattered into impossible contortions. The plates glowed faintly as though still alive, as though the bones themselves were backlit by some hidden illumination. Patterns emerged. The injuries were not random but sequential, almost like the beats of a grim ledger. It was a timeline written not in words, but in fractures and wounds. I whispered aloud without meaning to. They're not images, they're instructions. The thought chilled me. If the plates were not accidents, if they were recording what had not yet occurred, then they were a form of communication. But from where? Or from when? I began isolating myself. Elena, still, recovering, avoided the subject altogether. Administrators stopped asking questions. Perhaps they had grown tired of my evasions. In truth, I no longer cared what they suspected. My only obsession was to decode the sequence, to understand what these plates wanted from me. Days bled into nights. My office filled with stacks of envelopes, each containing a future sealed in emulsion. The Geiger-like clicking followed me everywhere, faint, irregular, but always present near the locked cabinet. Sometimes, in the silence between clicks, I swore I could hear faint respirations, as though the darkroom itself were breathing. Then came the plate I had been dreading, though I had never spoken the fear aloud. It emerged just after midnight. I had dipped the plate absent-mindedly, my eyes burning with exhaustion. But when the first faint arc surfaced, I knew instantly. The skull was my own. The familiarity was undeniable. The slope of the mandible, the shadow of a dental crown I had received years earlier. But my attention locked on the thorax, the ribs. They were not whole. They were shattered inward, collapsing upon the chest cavity. Several ribs driven so deep they threatened to puncture the lungs. I stared until my vision blurred. My professional instinct noted the injuries clinically, consistent with blunt force trauma, possibly a crush injury, survival unlikely. But beneath that, my human mind recoiled. I was staring at my own death, a plate of myself, written before the event. I tried, for hours, to rationalize. Perhaps I had contaminated the plate with a previous patient's image, and my mind was projecting recognition onto it. But the crown, the specific alignment of my ribs, the proportions, these were mine. The bones that had never lied were speaking a truth I could not reject. I wanted to destroy it. My hand hovered over the plate, ready to snap it in two, but I couldn't. Something in me, equal parts terror and reverence, refused. To break the plate felt like breaking the timeline itself, as though by destroying the message, I might accelerate its fulfillment. Instead, I sealed it in its own envelope, marked only with the time, 02:14 a.m. Then I slid it into the locked drawer, the clicks around me intensifying, as if the very air approved of my submission. In the following days, paranoia consumed me. Every hallway seemed to conspire. The mechanical groan of the hospital's elevators sounded like the straining ribs on my plate. The clang of gurney wheels echoed like snapping bone. I began avoiding stairwells, corridors, even the parking garage, as though death lurked in their architecture. And then the accident came. It was morning rush, a rare time when I was still present. In the hospital, an alarm shrieked down the hall. One of the central elevators had stalled between floors. The cables had frayed, the operator said. A rare but catastrophic failure. Staff gathered, panic humming through the building. I should have stayed away, but compulsion drew me in. Perhaps I thought I could outpace the plate, cheat it by forcing myself to witness rather than participate. I reached the landing just as the elevator gave way. The scream of metal splitting was deafening, a roar that seemed to reverberate through my very bones. The cab plummeted, and when it struck, the floor shook as though the hospital itself had convulsed. I rushed forward, joining the frantic rescue effort. We pried open twisted doors, reached into the wreckage, dragged survivors free. The air was thick with dust, with the copper tang of blood. In the chaos, I barely noticed when the ceiling panel above gave way. A beam, heavy, rusted, torn loose in the collapse, fell squarely onto my chest. The pain was immediate, searing. My ribs snapped inward with a sound I felt more than heard. Each breath became a scream muffled inside my own throat. As they pulled me free, Elena among them, I caught her gaze. Her eyes widened, flicked down at my torso, and I knew she understood. She had seen the plate. I survived, though barely. Broken ribs, internal bleeding, weeks of recovery. But survival did not matter. Because the plate had been right. Every line, every fracture, every shadow had been accounted for. It was like seeing my own obituary printed not in words, but in bone. And with that realization, the foundation of my career, of my life, collapsed. The bones had lied, or worse, they had spoken a truth outside the bounds of science, a truth I was never meant to hear. When I returned home, still bandaged, still aching, the clicking followed me. In the quiet of my study, I opened the locked drawer one final time. The plates inside seemed to glow faintly, pulsing with the inevitability of everything yet to come. And I knew this was no longer a matter of radiology. This was a dialogue with time itself. In medicine, the written record is everything. Every observation, every anomaly, every death, reduced to the precision of typed words, filed neatly for review. It was with that discipline that I sat at my desk, ribs still bound in surgical wrappings, and began to write the official report of the accident. I described the sequence of events clinically: the elevator cable failure, the collapse, the casualties. I noted the structural deficiencies, the approximate number of injured, the interventions performed. I even documented my own injuries, multiple rib fractures, pulmonary contusion, with the detachment of someone describing a stranger. But nowhere in that report did I mention the plate. How could I? The hospital demanded facts, not prophecy. To submit what I had seen, my own skeleton fractured before the accident occurred, would have branded me unstable, unfit to practice. So I sterilized the truth, erasing the impossible from the record, as though omission could save me from its weight. When I finished, I printed the report, signed it, and slid it into the administrative file. My hands did not tremble. They felt hollow, mechanical. Then I drafted my resignation. 19 years of service reduced to 2 paragraphs. I cited medical leave and personal reasons. I did not elaborate. The hospital board accepted it with little protest. Perhaps they were relieved to have me gone, to excise the unease that had festered in the radiology wing since the plates began their quiet rebellion. I left the hospital on a grey morning. The corridors stretched endlessly, their tiles gleaming under fluorescent light, the smell of antiseptic clinging to my clothes. For nearly 2 decades, these hallways had been my monastery of certainty. Now they felt like the architecture of betrayal. I told myself I was free, that by resigning, by stepping outside the walls where the impossible had first taken hold, I could leave the anomaly behind. But freedom proved an illusion. Because the plates followed me, In my small apartment, I kept one locked drawer in my study, a private reliquary of the evidence I had once hoped to explain. I told myself I would never open it. But some nights, when the city outside lay silent, I would hear it again. The faint clicking, like the static chatter of an invisible signal. And when the sound came, I would find new plates inside the drawer, plates I had not placed there. Blank film that had bloomed in my absence. Each one bore a skeleton I did not yet recognize. Sometimes a fractured arm, sometimes a crushed spine, sometimes a skull split neatly down the center. People who had not yet arrived at the hospital, people whose names I did not know. And yet I knew, with the certainty of the grave, that they would. I have stopped looking closely. I cannot. To study them is to see time's handwriting etched in calcium and marrow, a script no one was meant to read. Still, even without looking, I feel their presence. The plates are not passive records. They hum faintly when I touch the drawer, a vibration like breath caught in bone. And sometimes, in the half-light of dawn, I imagine I see them glowing. Silent lanterns of inevitability stacked against the dark. I no longer practice radiology. I no longer trust the discipline I once believed infallible. Bones do lie. Or perhaps they speak truths so vast that our science cannot contain them. What haunts me most is not the past plates, the ones already fulfilled, but the thought of those still to come. Futures already carved into emulsion. Fates already sealed in shadows. And I ask myself, each time I hear that faint, impossible clicking from the drawer, if bones can write themselves before the body arrives, what else is already written in us, waiting only to be revealed?